Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. In studio with me this evening and for a good long while for the next couple of weeks is Ashraf Essop, an attorney admitted in the High Court of South Africa, as well as a qualified lawyer in both Wales and England. Is that correct, Ashraf?
I have the QLTT in England and Wales.
Okay, brilliant. Ashraf, this is apparently this is an interactive show. This is a show where callers will be calling in on a weekly basis to pose questions to both myself and you, as well as to the guests that we have in studio. We hope to interview a wide variety of very interesting guests and cover very, very interesting topics. This is the new season of Legal Ease, so stay tuned and watch this. It's going to be better than Suits.
Well,
Ashraf, the issue that we need to deal with primarily today is an issue that is in the hearts and on the minds of Muslim people around the world. In fact, you don't even have to just be a Muslim to be affected by it. You just have to be human. It's the issue in the war-torn territories of Syria and Egypt, what is happening with the former president Morsi in Egypt, as well as the current president Assad in Syria. It is devastating. It is hard-hitting. It is heart-wrenching stuff. Your thoughts on the issues?
Well, there appears to be a number of conflict zones around the world, but particularly in the recent history or in the recent times, the two that stand out most appear to be Egypt and now Syria. So the United Nations, for example, has described the Syrian crisis as the worst in living recent memory.
Yeah.
I think that is a very important indication of the kind of difficulties that ordinary people are facing almost overnight. Egypt has also been in the news for the last few months, and again, the conflicts that appear to be prevalent in both those areas is an indication of tremendous human suffering and difficulty that they go out, that is out there. And our hearts go out to them. But more particularly,
may the Almighty grant them sabr and strengthen their iman, and inshallah, one day it will subside.
More particularly for us is the legal issues that are involved with regard to these conflict zones and what rights the South African legislation has with regards to people seeking asylum and refugee status in the country.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that, Ashraf, because earlier this afternoon I received a phone call from a man on the ground in Egypt. He's a student. He's studying currently in an Egyptian university. He's told me that the situation is dire. It's devastating. It's difficult for them to get to and from university. It's difficult for them to concentrate on their studies. And he made mention of the fact that he would be very desirous of traveling to South Africa, taking up study in South Africa, potentially work, and potentially even one day residing within the Republic of South Africa. Tell us, you're an expert in immigration and refugees, the Immigration Act rather, and the Refugee Act, and issues relating to that legal aspect of the industry. What are your thoughts on an Egyptian or a Syrian, someone from a country of that conflict, so to speak, to come into South Africa, and are they permitted? And how are they permitted, really speaking?
So there's two issues here. The first is the person wishing to study in the Republic. So that is governed by the Immigrations Act. The Immigrations Act says that you have to make application for a study permit. And there's a number of documents that you have to append to the application. One of them is that the institution has to accept you for a period of study, and they have to give a letter that you have paid this fees. And in addition, you have to have the ability to obtain a medical aid cover, because they don't really want you to become a burden to the state because you're on a study permit. So that would be the first basis on which you can gain entry to study. And
let's talk a little bit about what is synonymous with conflict territories. The word asylum pops up into my head. Obviously, being an attorney, I've dealt with these types of things, but not extensively. What is asylum? In layman's terms, obviously.
well, asylum is applies to anyone that seems to be fleeing some kind of danger or persecution anywhere in the world. So asylum seeker is a person who makes application for the protection of the state, the local state, South Africa.
So Syria and Egypt point in case.
Yes, the applicants would be able to apply for asylum, and that is governed by the Refugees Act. In fact, he has to present himself at the port of entry and request asylum at that point. And what would happen is they would process him with an asylum transit permit that is valid for 14 days. Those 14 days allows him to make himself available for an interview at one of the refugee reception offices. Now, he then follows that application, and there's a determination officer who would take a statement down from him regarding his personal circumstances. So basically, he then has to give a statement to the refugee status determining officer as to why he particularly wants to apply for asylum. So that's the refugee application itself. So at that point, he makes application.
So am I to understand that? Am I correct in saying that when he arrives at the port of entry, OR Tambo or any one of the harbors, or however he comes into the country, there's no determination made there. He's permitted 14 days to make this application in terms of the Refugee Act. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct, yes. So
he's
not even a refugee at that stage.
Yes,
he's just an applicant.
So you could be anybody really, from any country.
Yes.
At that point in time, the criteria that would be that be utilized to determine whether or not you are eligible, so to speak, for refugee status or for asylum status isn't even considered. You come in, we'll take 14 days, you'll be given a temporary asylum permit, and from there we can take it.
Absolutely. So there's no determination at that point. After he's been granted a temporary asylum seeker's permit, in terms of the Refugees Act, Section 23. Now, at that point, he has to, like I indicated previously, he has to give a statement of his personal circumstances, he has to give some personal information, he's fingerprinted, and he's issued with a document. Now, he then has to return to a refugee reception officers again for a second interview. And that time period is not yet determinable. It could take months for you before you are called back for your second interview. But there is a record of what you said in your first interview, and it has to match with what you're saying in your second interview. So one has to distinguish between various classes of refugees and asylum seekers. So there are some that are clearly from conflict zones. For example, Somalia, as you pointed out, Egypt, and Syria. Everyone knows in Syria right now there is a war de facto that people are being killed on a daily basis and they have to flee. They, in fact, a large part of their population, approximately 5 million, have already migrated to surrounding countries seeking refuge. So let's say if that applicant has to find himself by whatever means at a port of entry, he would then say that I'm here to seek asylum, and he'll be given a 14-day permit. Then he goes to the refugee status determining officer at one of the centers appointed, and he then gives a statement. And he has to give particulars about what he's fleeing, etc. Then that is followed up by a second interview. Now, in between, let's assume that process takes place fairly quickly, and he's arraigned for a second interview. Then the second interview, they would have to make a finding.
Ashraf, we're talking about South Africa, we're talking about Syria and Egypt, or at least Syria and Egypt.
Yeah.
There's a lot of territories in between our country and their countries. Why would they jump from Syria or Egypt and straight into South Africa? And is that a factor that the Republic of South Africa would consider when allowing asylum in those cases?
That would be one of the questions that they would put to the applicant. Why did you leave all your other territories and come directly to South Africa?
I mean, apart from the fact that South Africa is the best country, but other than that.
Well, having interviewed a number of these people and having acted for them, it is very interesting to note that the reasons that they pose for coming directly to South Africa is that we have an active judiciary, an independent judiciary, respect for the rule of law, and that South Africa actually pays more than just lip service to its international obligations. In terms of the United Nations Conventions on Refugees, the AU Convention on Refugees, and in fact the checks and balances built into the Refugees and Immigrations Act. So here they find that they could be given a fair hearing, a positive outcome to a genuine application. Having said that, there are a number of people that have immigrated or sought refugee status and put pressure on the system. So they would be people that we term economic migrants. So they're not really fleeing a particular social upheaval in their country, but they are fleeing for the reasons of wanting to seek a better life in the Republic.
And is that permissible?
Well, it's not permissible in the sense that you leave your country just to earn a better living elsewhere. But having said that, South Africa's economy was built on the bedrock of migrants from the neighboring states for time immemorial. These workers have been here on the basis of having to work in the mines. So economic, let's say, reasoning or reasons for fleeing is something that could be taken into account. Inter alia, everything
exactly,
else.
amongst other things. Now, it's because what I'm hearing ultimately is that South Africa's leniencies and tolerances insofar as immigration and refugee status is concerned, is actually, in a sense, a loophole for, as you mentioned, economic migrants to enter the country.
That has been the view of the department, and they intend tightening up on these. But it's very difficult at the outset. So then refugees can then migrate to permanent residence as is provided for in the Refugees Act. If they are certified to remain refugees indefinitely, then the Standing Committee would so certify, and armed with that letter or certification, they can apply for permanent residence in terms of the Immigrations Act.
So a really very liberal piece of legislation insofar as that section of law is concerned. Ashraf, just to unpack it very quickly, the Refugee Act. In the situation where the gentleman who contacted me from Egypt earlier, we tried to get him on the line, unfortunately he was unavailable. But if he now wanted to come in and he had a problem with study permit and obtaining a study permit, he could come into the country on that Section 23 asylum permit, is that correct?
Well, he could make application for the permit, and it's up to the refugee status determining officer to determine whether he's going to be able to prove it way down the line that he fled for the reasons that he's saying. But the refugee permit that is granted is extremely generous, as you've mentioned. Basically, it allows you to work or conduct a business or study without any restrictions. In fact, it is more generous than the Immigrations Act, which has a number of steps that you have to take. Remember, I was saying that a study permit requires a whole lot of steps and a whole lot of documents. So in this case, you don't have to go through all of those checks and balances. And I think precisely because of that reason, many people have found that they can exploit the asylum-seeking
as you see with a lot of the Zimbabwean nationals that have come across from Zimbabwe.
The Zimbabweans have been given a special dispensation until December 2011. But you have economic migrants from various parts of the world that have definitely, in the eyes of the Department of Home Affairs, taken advantage of it. Just the figures are quite startling. 180,000 applicants last year, 200,000 applicants the year before. So you could see that there's a high demand for legal presence in the Republic.
Well, there's a price to pay, I suppose, for living in one of the greatest countries in the world, and for that, and I suppose that's a reason why we keep our jobs. Ashraf, jazakumullah khairum, jazakallah to everybody in the audience and to everybody sitting at home, and thank you for your questions. We will definitely be back again just now for the second segment of the show. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. Ashraf, as you know, we are taking interactive calls from viewers at home and abroad as well. And on the line with us now, we have an attorney from Johannesburg. She's being dealt with an immigration case where she requires some assistance. Assalamu alaikum, Tasneem, and welcome to Legal Ease.
Walaikum salam, jazakallah. I do have a matter regarding a Mauritian national with a valid work permit. He arrived at the OR Tambo International Airport from a business trip, and the official made a racial slur at the airport. My client obviously retaliated, and the official acted spitefully, and the client was detained and said to be deported based on the claim that he failed to satisfactorily answer certain questions for the entry interview.
Okay. Jazakallah, very interesting question. Ashraf, Essop, as you know, is our immigration specialist. I'll hand over the call to him, and he'll explain to us, Ashraf, in a situation like this, valid work permit, person is valid in the country, no problems. What is she talking about when she refers to entrance interviews and failing to answer questions sufficiently?
Okay, the Immigration Act itself makes provision for an immigration officer to ask you certain questions regarding your permit. Now, he has to establish from his system primarily whether your permit is the correct permit or not before he even starts this so-called interview process. Let's assume he determines from the system that the permit is valid and it's validly issued. His questions should be very, very minimal in that case. Now, from what I understand Tasneem to have said, after he passed the interview regarding the permit,
His validity and so forth,
etc., it appears that he was subject to a barrage of verbal abuse. Is that right, Tasneem?
That's correct.
So you said racial slurs. Now, it's not within the powers of the immigration officer to enter into any kind of racial insults or questions. In fact, there's a case in the Supreme Court of Appeals that said that the immigration officer always has to employ discretion. And he should also find various means to satisfy the questions on his own. For example, he could call other people, he could call the wife, or he could call the employer.
So just to stop you there, so just so I understand, what Tasneem is saying is there was a valid work permit. He is validly allowed to work and study and live in the country. So even in a situation like that, a man can be denied entry into the Republic.
Not denied entry, he could be subject to questioning.
And should he fail that questioning, or whatever they call it, I don't know how you would fail questioning of that nature, but should he fail, is it then fair to or legal that he's denied entry into the Republic?
No. As I said, there's this High Court, there's a Supreme Court case that says that you have to favor liberty.
Yes, that's the underlying principle.
That's the underlying principle, which is something that is often overlooked by the immigration officers, simply because they have the ability to ask you a number of questions. However, the questions have to be relevant to the permit. As my understanding is that a racial slur is not part of the normal questioning.
Of course.
In that case, you could take the matter up with the immigration officer himself.
In his personal capacity or in his representative capacity? Yes.
Well, at that moment, he's acting within the course and scope of his employment. Correct. So you have to take down all of his details and ask him if that questioning, that line of questioning, is reasonable and whether it's valid, because it's got nothing to do with the permit. I mean, what is a racial slur got to do with your permit? Now, if we could have a little bit more information from Tasneem, what kind of slur this was. Maybe that will assist us in answering the question.
And also, I think what happened afterwards, was he subsequently allowed to enter, or was he then arraigned for deportation? Was he deported? What happened after that, Tasneem?
A client wasn't deported. Client wasn't deported because
was he being
obviously
arraigned? Oh, sorry to cut you off. So was he being arraigned for deportation? So they were preparing to deport him?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
So Ashraf, in a situation like that now, I mean, it's becoming quite serious. I'm assuming he has family in the Republic. What does one do now in a situation? What is the individual's right of recourse?
Well, I mean, you can object. That's your first line is to object to that action being taken by that immigration officer.
And how would we do that? Is that a normal application to the High Court or something of that nature?
You see, the Act provides for what we call exhausting internal remedies.
Okay.
Now, only in the event of those internal remedies being depleted do you have a right to approach the court.
Okay.
In terms of the uniform rules. You can bring an application based on urgency.
To interdict his deportation?
The deportation, yes. You have a right, because the Immigration Act itself says that, look, you have a right to enter, sojourn, and work in the Republic based on a valid permit, which is something that he seems to have been in possession of. Should he be unlawfully deprived of that right, and there isn't sufficient reasoning behind that, sufficient to justify a deportation, then you're certainly within your rights to approach first the department itself, failing any responses from them, the High Court for relief.
Okay, well, that's very, very interesting. Ashraf, just to close on that note, and Jazakallah Tasneem for your question, just to close on that note then, if now he is not deported and you're successful in that application, what is the other issue that can be explored with regards to perhaps maybe human rights or something of that nature?
Again, depending on the circumstances, and in this case we don't have a lot of details about what the exact nature of the insult was, but you could certainly take it up with the department itself and ask that an investigation be conducted. Alternatively, if you feel your rights have been breached, you can always approach the South African Human Rights Commission, more especially where it's a matter involving racism, which is something that we're extremely vigilant about.
Subject to, yes, and also subject to.
Yes.
Yeah. That's very interesting, and I think we can pick that up after the commercial break. We'll be taking a short commercial break, and when we return, we'll hear a little bit more about South African Human Rights Commission and as far as the Immigration Act is concerned. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. Ashraf, just before the break, we were discussing that issue of the South African Human Rights Commission, and the question that Sister Tasneem posed had a few aspects that we could investigate insofar as the Human Rights Commission is concerned. Can you elaborate on that?
Certainly. It appears that in this case there were undertones of racial insults. The South African Human Rights Commission is the body entrusted to investigate insults or deal with these matters. Now, in this case, there appears to be an insult by a state official, a departmental employee, against the applicant. The applicant has every right to refer it to the Human Rights Commission for further investigation and action. That would be the rights that he would enjoy, and it will be outside the ambit of the Department of Home Affairs.
So the scope is actually quite vast in insofar as this specific legal issue is concerned. Definitely insofar as human rights is concerned, I mean, we need to, in fact, maybe dedicate an entire show for that because it's quite a wide field of the law. Is that right?
Absolutely. Immigration law itself spans a number of different areas, not just human rights, not just immigration, not just refugees, but the Constitution as well. So it is a very, very wide subject. And the bottom line is that each of these applicants have a human rights aspect, and that has to be protected at all cost.
Really interesting stuff. Ashraf, I believe we have another call on the line for us. I believe it's also an attorney from Johannesburg. Her name is Nabila. Assalamu alaikum, Nabila, and thank you for calling into Legal Ease. You have a question for us?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Gee, it's also immigration related. I have a cousin who's been in the Republic for about 10 years now, and every month he's just been having an extension on his asylum permit by stamping it at the terror offices for a month or two. And he has applied for, and he has put forward an appeal application, and it was rejected in 2011. But he didn't receive any notice to say that his appeal had been rejected. And I think it was a month back that he was arrested and he was detained in a holding cell to be deported back to his country on account that his appeal application was rejected and he's illegally in the country.
Sure. Scary stuff. Scary stuff.
So please advise with regard to this.
Ashraf, as I was saying, I mean, scary stuff. I mean, to be in a situation like that, I mean, you don't know what's going to happen. You think, as far as you're concerned, you're in the country, you're in and out, or at least you're at the TIRO office, as she was referring to. TIRO stands for?
TIRO stands for the Shwane Interim Refugee Reception Office.
Okay, and they're responsible for what? Extending asylum permits or making decisions, is that right?
Well, let's just talk about this particular application itself that the caller is speaking about. So this falls to be determined within the ambit of the Refugees Act. Now, it appears from what you're saying that the applicant was here for a period of 10 years and he was given temporary asylum. Now, at some stage, that matter was adjudicated upon and he filed an appeal. From what you're saying, the outcome of the appeal process was not made clear to him, or he was not notified of the appeal or its outcome. Usually, the appeal process has tacked with it a secondary appeal process, so you have to be notified of those rights as well. Now, in the event that you're not notified of those rights, it would not be proper for the Department of Home Affairs Immigration Section or Refugee Section to subject you to arrest. Did I hear that the applicant was arrested?
That's correct.
He was. Then he would be within his rights to engage the department for his immediate release, failing which he has a right to bring an application in the High Court for his release. Our courts have held that a person should not be deprived of his liberty for 1 second longer than is necessary. So those rights are taken extremely seriously.
And as you're saying, so far as the previous caller is concerned, the underlying principle ultimately is to favor liberty.
No, absolutely. And the Department of Home Affairs, particularly the present minister, has gone through great lengths to try and make and educate the members of the employees that she has under her control. And she's been on record as having stated that she wishes that they would be more circumspect in the way they deal with matters. So she, as a minister, fully appreciates that not all members of her department would treat the applicants in the way that she would desire, or fully in terms of the law. Now,
and as you said, earlier in the show also, there's a fundamental obligation of the Republic in this regard. Is that right?
Yeah, look, the South African government doesn't just pay lip service to international and other protocols. For example, the United Nations protection, the United Nations protocols dealing with refugees, the High Commissioner, and the African Union as well. So, for example, in South Africa, they don't just pay lip service, but they allow the widest possible interpretation of their obligations. In fact, South Africa is the most generous of nations in the world that affords protection to refugees and asylum seekers. So it's not surprising that South Africa has become a magnet for lots and lots of people looking for asylum or refugee status within the Republic. In fact, the refugees and asylum seekers enjoy an extremely wide berth of rights, including the right to work, study, or open a business, which is something that you don't often see in other jurisdictions. For example, in Australia and other areas, refugees might be camped. In South Africa, refugees are not encamped.
And they're subjected to those camps. I mean, it's not to say that they can now go out into the workplace and actually engage in services and become sort of ordinary citizens, for lack of a better word.
See, each jurisdiction deals with its migrants differently. But South Africa, as I've mentioned, is the most generous when it comes to affording migrants and refugees rights. not to be encamped and to move around freely. So experience has shown that you'd find a refugee in the far-flung corners of South Africa, in places that you wouldn't even imagine that you'd find traders and people.
So then it lends more to the point, as we were discussing previously, about our brothers and sisters from Egypt and Syria now in those war-torn countries, like we were having in-depth discussion about, for them to come to South Africa. It's in fact very welcoming for them.
Well, the opinion seems to be that because South Africa has a rule of law, an independent judiciary, and a country that, like I say, doesn't just pay lip service to international protocols, but actually goes the extra mile in allowing them freedom of movement and cohabitation. So they believe that South Africa is one of those rare places on earth where you can almost hold out a beacon for all those lonely people, all those people affected by all the civil strife and other difficulties that they face in their countries of origin. In many ways, South Africa is likened to the Statue of Liberty. It's this Lady of Justice holding out a lamp to all people out there and promising them assistance. And we have, the courts have been extremely vociferous and have been extremely vigilant about the protection of individual rights for all peoples across all spectrums, but particularly with regard to immigrants and
refugees.
Yes.
Jazakallah Nabila for your question. I sincerely hope that answered your question in a nutshell or in detail. As I promised, some extremely valuable information coming from my esteemed co-host, Mr. Ashraf Essop, an expert in the field of immigration and an expert pretty much in law as a whole. A great legal mind in South Africa. Ashraf, Jazakumullah Khairun for that knowledge. And I look forward to working with you a lot more in the future and also for the rest of the shows. We've got to give the viewers what they want, and what they want is hard-hitting, useful information which they can utilize to strengthen their rights.
Nadeem, absolutely. It was a pleasure being hosted by you this afternoon. To our viewers out there, the success of this show will depend on your interaction. There are many platforms that we've created to allow this interaction. And please let us know if you'd like us to cover any specific topics. What we can promise you is that the new Legal Ease bouquet is very, very different from what you had in the past. Many, many interesting topics will be covered, very unusual platforms. And please keep us engaged.
And mainly because we're adding the element now of the current affairs and how it relates, legally speaking, to South Africa and to South Africans both within the Republic and abroad.
And we hope to bring you an Islamic ethos about various issues as well, not just the South African or international law as we know it.
Yeah, we're going to be sitting with some extremely learned legal minds, some of the greatest in the country, and I personally can't wait. I don't know about you.
No, I'm extremely excited about this new show.
Jazakumullah khairun to all of you at home. Jazakumullah again for all your questions, both via email and on Twitter and on Facebook. And we hope to see you guys all again very soon for an extended show coming up next week, and thereafter for the next few weeks, every Thursday night, with you on Legal Ease on ITV channel 347. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa khairun.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.